That day I thought I was just going to open the door to a carpenter, but instead I opened my heart, and it almost ruined my life, and that's how it was. Hello my dear friends, in this story I will tell you how one rainy day changed my life in the most unexpected way. Make yourself comfortable, grab a cup of tea or coffee and follow me to the end. I promise it will be hot and exciting. My name is Tyler, I'm 22 years old, and I live in a small town called Riverside, Ohio, where everyone knows each other and gossip travels faster than lightning. It was about 6 months ago when I first really noticed someone who made me feel more alive than ever. It was raining hard that day, the sky was overcast with gray clouds, and the drops rattled the windows of our old house while I lay on the couch with my phone. My father had gone into town on business, leaving me to keep an eye on the house, though the only thing I wanted to do in this weather was nothing. Just then I heard the sound of a pickup truck pulling up. It was Ryan, our local carpenter, who my dad had hired to fix the porch roof after the recent storm. Ryan was in his mid-40s, tall, with strong shoulders and hands used to hard work, and his quiet confidence always caught my eye. He parked in front of the house, pulled out his toolbox, and began to inspect the porch while the rain pounded on his back, turning the ground into a muddy mess. I decided to go out and warn him that my dad would be gone for a couple more hours, and at the same time offer to wait out the downpour inside so he wouldn't get soaked to the skin. Putting on an old windbreaker, I stepped onto the porch and shouted over the sound of the rain that he could come inside and dry off until the weather cleared up. Ryan turned around, smiled slightly, and walked toward me, shaking the water off his cap as the mud from his work boots left marks on the steps. As he stepped closer, I noticed the way his wet shirt clung to his body, outlining his broad chest and hard muscles, and I had to take a deep breath to keep from betraying my embarrassment. "Thanks, Tyler, I didn't think you'd be able to help me out," he said, wiping his face with his sleeve as the droplets dripped off his short blonde hair. His voice was deep, with a slight huskiness, and it made something inside me shiver. I pointed to the door, inviting him in, and felt my pulse quicken as he pulled off his jacket, exposing strong forearms with veins showing. We walked to the living room, and I offered him a towel so he could clean himself up a little after the rain. He took it, nodding gratefully, and started wiping his neck and arms, while I stood beside him, trying to keep my cool and not stare too long. "The weather is total shit today, nothing much to do," he said, looking out the window where the rain was pouring down like a bucket. I mumbled something about the forecast, and wondered how this ordinary day had suddenly become so exciting. And then something I'll never forget happened. He reached for the toolbox he'd left by the door, and his shirt pulled up, revealing a strip of tan skin at his waist hard, with a faint shadow of hair. I froze, feeling the heat rise to my cheeks, and quickly turned away to the kitchen table, muttering that I'd put the kettle on now. Ryan grinned as if he'd noticed something and said, "Are you all right, Tyler? You look like I scared you." I nodded, trying to hide a smile, but I knew this moment would forever be etched in my memory. It had only been an hour since Ryan had stepped into our house in Riverside, and I could already feel the air between us growing heavy. We sat in the living room, him toweling his wet hair, and I fiddled with the kettle in the kitchen, trying to keep my mind off how he looked without his jacket. The rain was still outside, drumming on the roof, and it made for a cozy atmosphere, though inside I was seething with nerves. I brought 2 mugs of hot tea and set them on the coffee table, trying to act like nothing was wrong. Ryan took the mug, wrapping his big arms around it, and said, "Thanks, Tyler, you really helped out. I hate getting wet in a downpour like this." I sat across from him on the couch, trying not to stare too long into his gray eyes, which seemed to see more than I wanted to show. We started talking about all sorts of things: the weather, about how the hurricane a week ago had torn up half the porch, about how my father was always putting off repairs. He told me how he'd once fixed a roof in a snowstorm in a neighboring town, and I caught myself listening not so much to the words as to his voice. "Have you ever fixed anything with your hands yourself?" he asked suddenly, looking at me with a slight smile that made my insides clench. I shrugged, mumbling that I was more about learning than hammering, and he laughed, leaning back in his chair. Then he got up to take the empty mug to the kitchen, and I noticed how his wet shirt was still clinging to his back, outlining every muscle. I followed, ostensibly to put the dishes away, but really just didn't want to let him out of my sight. He put the mug in the sink and turned to me, wiping his hands on his jeans, and I said suddenly, "If you want, I can get you a dry t-shirt, because this one's totally soaked." Ryan looked at me, squinting slightly, and nodded. "Yeah, that would be nice, if it's not too much trouble." I dashed to my dad's room, found an old gray t-shirt, and came back, feeling my heart pounding somewhere in my throat. When I handed him his clothes, he took them and suddenly started pulling off his wet shirt right in the kitchen without going to the bathroom. I stood like a dumbfounded man, watching him pull the fabric down over his head, revealing a broad chest and firm abs, lightly covered in tan from working in the sun. "Don't look like that, Tyler. It's not like I'm a model," he said with a chuckle, but there was something warm, almost playful in his voice. I turned away, muttering something about the kettle, even though it had long since cooled, and felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment. He pulled on a dry t-shirt that fit a little too tightly, and I couldn't help thinking that it only emphasized his figure. We went back to the living room, and I offered to turn on the TV to lighten things up, but the tension between us was still there. He sat closer to me on the couch than he had before, and I felt the warmth of his shoulder as he reached for the remote. "You know, you're not a bad guy, Tyler," he said suddenly, looking at the screen where some old car movie was playing. I turned to him, not knowing what to say back, and noticed his hand resting very close to mine on the pillow. At that moment I realized that this day wasn't going to end with just a cup of tea, and I felt a twinge of anticipation of something more. It had been about 40 minutes since Ryan and I had sat on the couch in the living room of our house in Riverside, and I was still trying to keep my cool. The TV was humming softly, showing some old action movie, but I barely heard what was going on because all my attention was on him. He was sitting next to me, a little closer than necessary, and I could feel the warmth of his body as his hand rested on the back of the couch, almost touching my shoulder. The rain outside had eased a little, but the sky remained dark, and the room was cozy with the light of the lamp and the smell of freshly brewed tea. I tried to focus on the screen, but my thoughts were jumbled, and I caught myself furtively staring at his profile, the sharp cheekbones, the light stubble, the calm expression. At one point he turned to me and asked, "Are you even watching this movie, or are you just pretending?" His voice was low, with a slight sneer, and I felt the blood rush to my face when he caught my gaze. I mumbled something like, "No big deal, just background," and he smiled, leaning back, causing his knee to lightly graze mine. "If you want, I can tell you how I once fixed a roof in a rain like this," he said, looking at me with interest, and I nodded, though I didn't care what he was talking about as long as he kept going. He started talking about some construction site in Cleveland where he'd almost fallen off a ladder, and I listened, trying not to think about how close we were sitting. Then he stopped talking and the room was silent, broken only by the sound of rain and explosions from the TV. I noticed that his hand was now resting on the pillow very close to mine, and I suddenly wanted to do something to make sure this moment didn't go to waste. "If you're cold after the rain, I can get you a blanket," I said, trying to sound calm, though my voice shook a little. Ryan looked at me, squinting his eyes, and replied, "I'm not cold, but if you want, you can warm me up yourself." His words hung in the air, and I froze, not believing he'd said it, but there was something warm, almost inviting in his gaze. I swallowed, feeling my heart beat faster, and slowly moved toward him until our shoulders touched. He didn't pull away, but instead turned toward me, and I felt his breath on my cheek, warm and calm. "Tyler, are you sure you know what you're doing?" He asked quietly, but there was no judgment in his voice, just curiosity. I nodded without taking my eyes off him, and suddenly he put his hand on my shoulder, squeezing it lightly, sending a shiver down my spine. We sat like that for a second, staring at each other, and then I leaned closer, and he met me halfway, touching my lips with his in a soft but steady motion. It wasn't fast or rushed, just natural, like we both knew it was going to happen. I felt the warmth of his palm as he ran his hand down my back, pulling me closer, and it was as if everything around me disappeared, the TV, the rain, the whole world. We pulled away for a second to breathe and he smiled, looking into my eyes. "So, Tyler, was that warmer than the blanket?" I laughed softly, feeling the tension go away, and nodded, realizing that this moment was the start of something big. We sat like that for a while longer, snuggled up against each other, until I heard the sound of a car pulling up. My dad was back sooner than I expected. The sound of my father's car pulling up pulled me out of the warm comfort Ryan and I had just created in the living room of our house in Riverside. I pulled away from him abruptly, feeling my heart racing with panic, and quickly muttered, "It's Dad, he shouldn't notice anything." Ryan nodded, understanding the situation immediately, and moved to the other end of the couch, grabbing the remote like we'd been watching that stupid action movie all night. I fixed my hair, trying to look calm as my dad's footsteps approached the front door, and glanced at Ryan. He looked relaxed, like nothing had happened. The door opened and my dad walked in, shaking the water off his umbrella before looking at us in surprise. "Ryan? You're still here? Did the rain hold off or something?" Ryan shrugged, smiling that calm smile of his, and replied, "Yeah, the downpour messed up all the plans. Tyler let me in to wait it out." My dad nodded, throwing me a look full of approval, and said, "Good for you, son, you didn't leave a man to get wet outside." I squeezed out a smile, feeling inside still shaking from what had been between us just a moment ago, and mumbled something about tea. My dad made his way to the kitchen and I whispered to Ryan, "Do you think he suspected something?" He shook his head, quietly replying, "Don't worry, it's fine, we were just having tea." When my dad returned with a bottle of water and sat down in a chair, Ryan and I continued to pretend to be engrossed in the movie, even though I could barely understand what was happening on the screen. At one point Ryan stood up, saying that the rain was almost over and he had to get going so he wouldn't have to stay out late. I walked him to the door, feeling everything inside clench at the thought that this evening could have ended very differently if it hadn't been for my dad. At the threshold, he turned to me and said quietly, "Tyler, give me your number in case I get caught in the rain again." I quickly scribbled the numbers on a piece of paper I found in my pocket and slipped it into his hand before my father left the living room. A couple of days later I got a message from him. Nothing special, just, "Hi, how are you?" But I was overjoyed. We started texting, rarely at first, then almost every day, discussing everything from the weather to how he once got stuck at a construction site because his car broke down. About a week later, he wrote, "If you're free on Saturday, stop by my place and I'll show you how I make furniture for customers." I agreed, feeling the anticipation growing every day, and that Saturday I went to his place, leaving my father with some inexplicable excuse about friends. His house was on the outskirts of Riverside, small but cozy, with a workshop in the backyard that smelled of wood and varnish. He met me at the door, in a simple t-shirt and jeans, and led me inside, showing me the chairs he was making for a client. We chatted and laughed, and at one point he said, "You know, Tyler, you're easy, I didn't think it would be like this." I felt a warmth in my chest and replied, "I didn't think so either, but I like the way it's going." Then he showed me to the kitchen where he was making coffee, and as I took the mug, our hands accidentally touched, and he didn't move away, just looked at me with the same warmth he had that night. We sat there late into the night, and I realized that it wasn't just a chance encounter, something was growing between us, quiet and sure. It had been a week since my first visit to Ryan's house on the outskirts of Riverside, and I still couldn't get that night out of my head. We'd sat in his kitchen late into the night, drinking coffee, laughing at his stories of failed orders, and every time our gazes met, I felt something inside me light up. After that meeting, we texted almost every day, and I began to notice that I looked forward to his messages more than anything else. That Friday he texted, "If you're free tomorrow, come over and help me with a project and then we'll relax." I immediately agreed, feeling the anticipation mixed with slight excitement, and told my dad I was going to a friend's house for the weekend so I wouldn't have to answer too many questions. The next day I arrived at his place near noon, when the sun had already warmed the air and his yard smelled of freshly cut grass and wood. Ryan met me outside the workshop, wearing an old paint-stained t-shirt and with a hammer in his hand, and said, "Glad you came, Tyler, we're going to be assembling a table for the neighbors today." We started working together. He showed me how to hammer the nails in properly, and I tried not to get distracted by the way his hands moved with such confidence. As we fiddled with the wood, he talked about his life, how he used to work construction in Columbus and then decided to settle down here and do furniture. I listened, occasionally inserting my own stories about school, and felt as comfortable with each other as if we'd known each other a lot longer. By late afternoon we were done, and he suggested we come inside for a bite to eat and relax after work. We sat on his couch with plates of pizza he had ordered, and he turned on some old concert on the TV, saying, "I love this kind of music, it's relaxing after a long day." I nodded, though I was looking more at him than at the screen, noticing how he leaned back with his legs stretched out and looked so relaxed. At one point he turned to me and said, "You know, Tyler, you did really well today, your hands are all over the place." I smiled, feeling warm from his words, and replied, "Only because you explained it okay, I would have messed up on my own." Then he put his hand on my shoulder, squeezing it lightly, and I felt the same current run through me as it had that night in the living room. "Aren't you tired after all that?" he asked, looking into my eyes, and I shook my head, even though everything inside was shaking from having him so close. I pulled myself closer to him, feeling the couch sag beneath us, and he didn't pull away. Instead, his hands slid down my back, pulling me closer. We stared at each other for a second, and then I leaned in, and he met me, touching his lips to mine in a warm, confident movement that took my breath away. It wasn't just a continuation of what had started before, but something deeper. I felt his warmth, his calm, and it was like everything around me slowed down. His hands stayed on my back as we sat like that, pressed against each other, and I realized I wanted to stay here longer. When we pulled away, he smiled and said, "Tyler, you make me feel younger than I am." I laughed, feeling the tension go away, and replied, "And you make me forget about everything else." We spent the rest of the evening together, taking our time, and I knew this was just the beginning of something more. It had been a couple weeks since that Saturday night when I'd stayed at Ryan's house until late that night, and I'd thought about him almost constantly since then. We didn't see each other every day. He was busy with orders, and I was trying not to fail classes at the local college, but our correspondence kept us in touch. Every message he sent, even a simple, "What's up, Tyler?" made me smile, and I caught myself checking my phone more often than I should. That Friday night he texted, "If you want to come over tomorrow, I'll give you a little surprise after work." I immediately replied that I would, and the whole next day was spent waiting while I made up a story to my dad about going to a buddy's house out of town. I arrived at his place in the late afternoon, as the sun was setting, turning the sky over Riverside orange. Ryan was waiting for me outside the house, wearing jeans and a clean t-shirt, no trace of paint or dust, and looking like he'd cleaned himself up on purpose. "Come on, let me show you something," he said with a slight smile and led me not to the workshop, but to the backyard where there was a small table with 2 chairs. There were a couple bottles of beer and a bowl of chips on the table, and a portable heater was burning nearby, casting a warm glow on the grass. I was surprised and asked, "Is that it for me?" He nodded, shrugging, "Thought you could use some relaxation after all that running around." We sat down at a table, and he opened a beer, handing me the bottle as the cool evening air mixed with the heat from the heater. We chatted about all sorts of things: his last order, how I'd almost failed a history test, how he'd once spent the night in the woods because his car had broken down. He told it calmly, with the same confidence that always clung to me, and I could feel the tension of the week ebbing away with every sip. At one point he looked at me and said, "You know, Tyler, I like having you around. Things are easier with you than I'm used to." I smiled, feeling warm in my chest, and replied, "I like it too, didn't even think it would be like this." Then he got up to put wood on the heater, and I followed him, as if I didn't want to let him out of my sight for a second. When he finished, I stepped closer, feeling the cold air contrast with his body heat, and put my hand on his shoulder. He turned toward me, and I saw something new in his eyes, not just warmth, but a desire he was no longer hiding. "Tyler, are you sure you want to do this?" he asked softly, but his voice was firm, like he was waiting for my answer. I nodded, feeling my pulse quicken, and pulled myself closer to him until our faces were right next to each other. He leaned toward me, and his lips found mine in a movement that was soft but full of power, making me dizzy. His hands slid around my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt the warmth of his palms through my jacket as we stood there, surrounded only by the sounds of the night. It wasn't just a continuation, it was a step further. I could feel his breath, his scent, and it was like everything around me dissolved into this moment. When we pulled away, he ran his hand down my back and said, "Let's go inside, it's getting cold in here." We went inside, and I knew that this evening would leave a lasting impression on my memory. It had been a night since Ryan and I had crossed the threshold of his house after that night in the backyard, and I could still feel the warmth of his presence, like it had soaked into me. We'd gone inside then, leaving the beer and chips on the table, and he'd closed the door, cutting us off from the chill of Riverside and the rest of the world. The dim light from a lamp burned in the living room, and an old blanket lay on the couch, which he carelessly adjusted, inviting me to sit down. I threw off my jacket, feeling my heart pounding somewhere in my throat, and sat down next to him while he turned on some movie on the TV. "Relax, Tyler, we're in no rush to get anywhere," he said, looking at me with that calm smile that always made me lose myself. We sat close, and I felt the warmth of his shoulder as the screen flashed through some scene I wasn't even trying to understand. At one point he put his hand on my knee, squeezing it lightly, and I turned to him, feeling the tension between us build again. "Are you okay?" he asked, noticing I was holding my breath, and I nodded, even though everything inside was shaking from how natural everything was happening. I moved closer and he met me, touching my lips with his in a movement that was soft but full of confidence, like he knew what I wanted. His hand slid down my back, pulling me to him, and I felt the warmth of his body envelope me as we sat there, losing track of time. It wasn't just a continuation of what had started before, but something more. I could feel his breath on my neck, his palms on my waist, and it was as if everything around me had shrunk to that moment. We pulled away just to breathe, and he was looking at me with such warmth that I couldn't look away. "Tyler, you make me forget everything," he said softly, and I smiled, feeling his words echoing somewhere deep inside. We spent most of the evening like that, pressed against each other until the movie was long over and silence filled the room, broken only by our breathing. I knew I wanted to stay, but I knew my father would be waiting for me at home, and it was weighing on me more than I wanted to admit. It was past midnight when I finally got ready to leave, and Ryan walked me to the door, putting his hand on my shoulder. "Be careful on the road, and text me when you get there," he said, looking at me with the same concern I'd seen in his eyes all evening. I nodded, feeling joy and slight anxiety mingle inside, and drove away, leaving him standing on the doorstep. At home, I snuck into my room, trying not to wake my father, but he was still waiting for me in the living room with the lights on. "Where have you been so late, Tyler?" he asked, looking at me suspiciously, and I mumbled something about friends and pizza, hoping he wouldn't dig any deeper. He nodded, but I noticed his gaze lingered on me a little longer than usual and said, "You're an adult, but don't forget to be careful." I drifted off to my room, feeling the secret with Ryan getting harder, but at the same time realizing that I didn't want to change anything. Lying in bed, I texted Ryan that I had made it and he replied, "Good night, Tyler, see you later." Those words warmed me more than the blanket, and I knew our connection was just beginning. It had been a few months since I'd started secretly dating Ryan, and every night we spent in Riverside was becoming more and more important to me. That last time I visited him was on a Saturday, when the snow was already covering the yard and his house smelled like coffee and wood from his workshop. We sat by the heater, chatting about how he wanted to take a vacation in the spring and I was planning to finish college. The tension between us was familiar, and when I moved toward him, he put his arms around me, pulling me closer until the warmth of his hands melted the cold outside the window. "Tyler, you're making me think about the future," he said, and I replied that I didn't want to lose that either. We spent the night together, feeling like it wasn't just meetings anymore, but something real, and I left in the morning knowing that I would soon have to make a decision about how to move on with this secret. It's April, and I'm sitting in my room in Riverside looking at a text from Ryan, "Come visit this weekend, I miss you." We're still together, though my dad still thinks I'm traveling to see friends and I'm not ready to tell him yet. Our meetings have become less frequent because of my studies and his work, but every time I see him, everything inside comes alive. I don't know what will happen a year from now, but with Ryan I feel like myself, and that's worth all the secrets. Maybe one day I'll find words for my dad, but for now, this is our story and I love the way it's going. Thank you for watching and I will see you in the next video. If you like the story, please give this video a thumbs up and leave a comment below.